In previous videos, we have begun the process of describing a metaphysical framework through which we can now start describing parts of reality with. In this video, we're going to be talking about what is information or the content of my metaphysical model. Everything that you interact with, whether it's a physical, tangible thing or a thought in your head, is some kind of information existing within an experience. The category of information can be described by three necessary parts that we will cover in this video. Once we have identified the three parts that the category of information is constructed of, we will go over how we can usefully regard reality with these three descriptions of information. So what is information? What is required for information to exist within our reality? From the perspective of my model, there are three necessary components or pieces of the category of information in order for it to exist. In a previous video, I used the metaphor of existence as being the domain of a function that is the knowing of the content or the range. This perspective makes it easier for us to understand how these three parts construct the category of information. Let's go over what domain and range is real quick. So domain is the values that a function is operating across. So if we do the positive real integers as an example, we could say 0, 1, 2, and 3, in this case, on to infinity, is our domain. In order to use domain and range, we have to have some kind of function that is operating across the domain. In this case, let's just define our function as a simple line. So we're going to say 4x plus 1. And now in order to get the range or the output of our function, we simply operate across the domain using our function. So if we put 0 into 4x plus 1, we're going to get the value 1. If we put 1 in, we're going to get 5. If we put 2 in, we're going to get 9. And if we put 3 in, we're going to get 13. In my model, I describe existence as the domain, knowing as the function, and information as the range. And so as the existence is being operated across by the knowing, there is an output of that process or that function of knowing that is the range or the information and content of existence. From our context, this range, which is the information or content of existence, is the qualia or the experience of something occurring. It is the details, the tangibility, the feelings, the senses, the understanding that there is something and not nothing. So now that we have this metaphor to use, let's talk about the three constituent parts that information is constructed of from my model. So the first requirement of information is that it has the possibility of existing. That is to say that if our function at no point as it operates across the domain of existence reaches some particular value, that particular value therefore does not or will never exist. The nothingness that we talked about in previous videos and these values that existence is not taking are one and the same. It's an oxymoron in a sense to even talk about them because we can't actually talk about something that doesn't exist or doesn't have the possibility of existing. So then if the information is possible, or at least let's say that the function of knowing as it operates across the domain of existence has the possibility or could create the category of information that we're regarding, then we have to say that the value that the function is taking has to be defined. If we're describing a function like we have here on the right, the definition of the range is defined as the value that that function takes at the domain. So we can think of this second particular part as how the information is defined or how it separates itself from the rest of existence. If we put a value in from the domain into our function, but we don't actually get any value that is distinct from any other value, then it either is one of the previous values or it doesn't exist. So that is to say, if the information does not in some way distinguish itself from the rest of reality, then it does not exist. Once we make the statements that the information has the possibility of arising out of the function of knowing and the information differentiates itself from the rest of reality, then so long as the information does end up existing, it exists. If there is the possibility that the function can reach particular values but never does, we have to necessarily say that those values do not exist. There has to be some particular location along the domain of existence that the function of knowing produces this particular category of information in order for it to actually exist. We're now going to do a brief overview of the previous videos that have covered my model. So if we look here at the bottom, we have this acknowledgement or this certainty, which is the fact that there is existence. So this statement of there is existence existence doesn't bring with it any kind of differentiation, any kind of certainty or formalities that we can apply onto any of our knowledge or any of anything. It is simply the statement that there is existence. There is this kind of intangible, indescribable thing that is occurring, but nonetheless, although we can never describe the thing, we have certainty that that thing is existing, because if it wasn't existing, then we wouldn't exist and we wouldn't be having this experience to say that it does or doesn't exist. From here, I begin constructing my model atop this axiom with a statement of existence, which is identified as these brackets, knows, which is identified with this arrow, information, which is identified with the circle. So this diagram is supposed to be a useful metaphor to allow us to kind of understand the intuition that I'm trying to apply here with this statement of existence knows information. And so now when we start trying to define the parts of this description that I've made, we run into issues with the first two pieces. We do not have access to the process that is the knowing and the process that is the existing. We are those things. We are the knowing. We are the existence. We are the entirety of whatever is occurring as it's occurring within our experience, but we do not have the information or the language in order to describe the first two components of my description, knowing and existence. If we try to describe existence itself with language, how it operates, what it does, what it's like, what the experience of existing is, all language fails us and we can't actually express that. Similarly, we can't express the relationship between the existence and the information that is existing. And that's why this word knowing is useful, but we don't have an apt description or a way of describing with language what that process of knowing actually is or what is occurring. Within my model, the brain is a physical object that is permutating, or rather it is changing states across the fourth dimension as we are stretching it out. Each of those states is a particular configuration or arrangement of the information inside of the brain. And that information inside of the brain is what gives us the sense or the understanding or the tangibility of everything that we're experiencing. Because information is content, we do have a way of describing or categorizing what information actually is. Any kind of description that I apply onto my experience exists within the content of existence. And so that is to say, the information itself exists inside of the information of existence. And so we can describe information unlike the knowing and the existence because we are, in essence, using information to express information. And so in this way, we are capable of describing what information is or how it exists. And so from here, we start describing information with these three descriptions that I have placed. So we have the possibility of the information, we have the definition of that information, and then we have the fact that the information exists at some point within existence. Let's start talking about the very first component or requirement of the category of information. That is the possibility of the information existing. So if the information can't exist, then it doesn't. Now, from a subjective agent's perspective, there is some possibility that the molecular structure of H2O, as we think of water, exists within reality. Similarly, we are saying that there is some possibility that the molecular structure of HO4 exists within reality. The domain and the function, from our perspective, are unknown. We don't know the values that the function of knowing is operating across for the domain, and we don't actually know what the function of knowing is or how it's described. We do know the information or the content that is within our experiences that is arising out of the function of knowing operating across the domain of existence. And so from our perspective, because of this uncertainty, we have to say that there is some possibility that, let's say in our example, the value 5 arises out of our function as a result of any particular domain that the function is operating on. From the universe's perspective, there is no such thing as the possibility of something existing. We are saying that within these two components, from our greater perspective that we're taking here of being existence, we do know what the domain is and we do know what the function is. Between these two pieces, do we expect or can we expect that the range is going to at some point take any particular value? So although we're not saying explicitly at this point that that particular range is existing, we are simply saying with the domain and the function that is operating across that domain, can we say yes or no to the question that the range of some particular value could exist? So once we have identified that a category of information can exist, we now have to say what describes that category or what allows that category to differentiate itself from the rest of the information that is existing. So that is to say, for a category to exist, it must be in some way contrasted to all other categories that exist. So essentially what this component of the information is the value that the information is taking when the knowing is operating on any piece or any part of the existence. There is uncertainty about what the domain of existence actually is and what the function of knowing actually is. We would have some idea that there is some possibility that some value exists coming out of these two unknown components. And whatever value that we are saying we are uncertain is existing is, in essence, the function. So we kind of derive from the possibility of some kind of information existing the fact that it has some value that is existing. Categories of information from our perspective have some amount of effectiveness as we experience them. So if we talk about water, there are different instances of what water is that still falls into the category of water. In the example here, we can say that this form of water can often be found in the three physical states of matter that we traditionally think of. It is often found in a gaseous state, it is often found in a liquid state, and it is often found in a solid state. This particular type of water is very effective at doing the things that we expect it to do. But if we take an ionized water molecule like H3O+, very ineffective at being a gas, very ineffective at being a liquid, and very ineffective at being a solid. Within a category of information, we can define some effectiveness that that piece of that information that we're observing has with regard to the rest of the category. Water is categorized with a distinct behavior of becoming a liquid or becoming a solid in particular temperatures or pressures. When we then extend those rules onto a molecule that is still within that category, that is still considered water, or rather an ionized piece of water, we are now no longer meeting the effectiveness that we would have expected from a non-ionized water molecule. Now, of course, we can then just create a separate category, separate out ionized water from non-ionized water, and describe them as two distinct pieces of phenomena. Now, from the universe's or existence's perspective, there is no ineffectiveness about anything that is occurring because it just simply exists. There is no way it could have existed otherwise. And so there is no such thing as an effectiveness with regard to any kind of goal or outcome that we expect. An easier way to think about this component of the category of information, rather than the definition of the information, is to say that it is the function of the information. The water molecule functions a particular way within the context of, let's say, a high pressure or a low temperature environment, and that it becomes ice or a solid. Every category of information has some function that arises out of the fact that that piece or category of information exists. From the universe's perspective, the function is rather to say the distinction that that information is providing itself to stand out against the rest of the content of existence. So finally, in order for a piece of information or the category of some information to exist, it must actually be instantiated, or rather it must actually exist somewhere within the content of existence. So anything that is not implemented in reality does not exist. From our perspective, it's easier to call this action. So that is to say, if there's a category of information that we're defining, when it is currently existing within our experience, we are describing that category as having some amount of action, or rather to say, some amount of implementability. If we look at the category of water existing as ice, it has a high amount of implementability, or a high amount of action from our observations. Water can exist as what's called a hexamer. So because hexamers can exist, there is some function that arises out of that possibility of existing, but we would say that a hexamer has a very low amount of action. With the data that we have about existence, it appears that water molecules forming into hexamers is a very uncommon thing, or that is to say, it is implemented or instantiated very little within existence. From the possibility of a category of information existing, some value arises, or rather some function arises out of that category of information being possible to exist. And then we would say, at some point across the domain of existence, does our function f of x actually become the value 5 at some point across the domain of existence? Although there is a possibility of some value existing, if the function of knowing never actually gets to that value or never actually operates across some particular domain of existence that gives us that value, then it doesn't exist. So let's just quickly go over everything that has been talked about. Within my model, there is existence, which is this entire diagram. The existence itself is described as existence knowing information. We cannot describe with language this part of existence, or rather to say, we cannot describe the knowing and the existence. They don't fall into language in any way that's comprehensible. But we can describe the information or the content of existence because that is what provides the tangibility and the distinction of every kind of experience that we have. And what we say it's composed of is information. So that's to say that if there is some information, it has the possibility of existing within the content of reality. If it's possible for that information to exist within reality, then it has some kind of function that distinguishes it from the rest of the content of reality. And then finally, if it's possible for a category of information to exist, and it's defined as having some kind of function, then if it does exist, it's going to have some kind of action that performs that function. It is implemented within the content of existence. We can find it as we are operating through the content of existence. So in the videos that follow, we're going to be talking about how we can take these three pieces and how we can start applying this analysis of information to our day-to-day lives as being a human.